The unraveling. The city streets buzzed with life as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the buildings. The hum of the patrol car's engine was the only sound Officer Dan Walker and his rookie partner, Caleb, could hear as they cruised along one of the quieter districts of the city. Despite the peaceful exterior, tension had been bubbling beneath the surface for weeks, ever since the department had appointed a new captain. The rumors and murmurs that circulated throughout the station were hard to ignore, and Dan, a seasoned officer, had plenty to say about the new leadership. "Can you believe they made him captain?" Dan spat out, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His gruff voice barely masked his frustration. "All my years on the force, and this is the thanks we get. Putting someone like him in charge." Caleb shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had only been on the force for a few months, and already he found himself questioning his place in it. Dan's comment wasn't subtle, and Caleb knew exactly what he was implying. The new captain, Marcus Williams, was one of the most decorated officers in the department, known for his integrity and fair leadership. But to Dan, none of that mattered. The fact that Captain Williams was a black man was all it took for him to be unworthy of his respect. "Maybe we should give Captain Williams a chance," Caleb suggested, his voice cautious. "He's been with the department for a long time. People say he's one of the best." Dan scoffed, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. "Knave. That's what you are, Caleb. They're all the same. I've seen it time and time again. They get a little power, and it goes straight to their heads. Can't trust them." Caleb stayed silent. He didn't know how to respond. His gut told him that Dan was wrong, but as a rookie, challenging a veteran officer like Dan felt almost impossible. He stared out the window, watching the city pass by as they turned onto Main Street. That's when Dan's eyes narrowed. Ahead of them, a sleek black sedan drove smoothly down the road, obeying all traffic laws. The driver, a well-dressed black man, was calm behind the wheel. But something about him rubbed Dan the wrong way. "Look at that," Dan muttered. "Bet he stole that car." Caleb frowned, his discomfort growing. "Sir, we don't know that. He's not doing anything wrong." Dan shot Caleb a sharp look. "That's what you think. You're too green to see it, but I can tell. Time for a little routine check." Without hesitation, Dan flipped on the patrol car's lights. Caleb's stomach twisted as the black sedan pulled over smoothly to the side of the road. The tension inside their patrol car was thick, almost suffocating, as Dan parked and unbuckled his seatbelt. "Sir, I don't know if this is a good idea," Caleb said softly, his voice barely audible. Dan ignored him, opening the door with a smirk on his face. He sauntered toward the sedan, his body language exuding a sense of authority and menace. Caleb hesitated for a moment, his heart racing. Everything about this felt wrong, but what could he do? He was just a rookie. Reluctantly, he got out of the car and followed Dan, his footsteps heavy with unease. As they approached the vehicle, the driver's window rolled down smoothly. The man inside was composed, but his eyes held a hint of wariness as he glanced between the two officers. "Is there a problem, officers?" the man asked, his voice calm and measured. Dan leaned in closer, his face mere inches from the driver's. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone dripping with disdain. The driver complied without protest, handing over his documents. Caleb noticed the slight tremble in the man's hands, a small sign of the fear he was trying to hide. As Dan inspected the documents, his lip curled into a sneer. "Devin Matthews," Dan read aloud, emphasizing the name as if it carried some hidden meaning. "And what brings you to this neighborhood, Mr. Matthews?" "I'm on my way to a business meeting," Devin replied evenly. "Is there a reason you pulled me over?" Dan ignored the question, his eyes narrowing, as he scrutinized the man before him. "Step out of the vehicle." Devin hesitated, his eyes flicking to Caleb, silently pleading for reason. Caleb could feel the tension rising. He knew this was wrong. This wasn't a routine traffic stop. This was something far more insidious. "Sir," Devon said, his voice steady despite the situation, "I haven't done anything wrong. Why are you asking me to step out?" Dan's expression darkened. "We ask the questions here. Step out of the vehicle." Caleb's heart raced as Devon slowly opened the car door and stepped out. Every instinct told Caleb that this was going to spiral out of control if he didn't do something. But what could he do? Dan was his superior, a veteran officer with decades of experience. He knew the rules of the game, and Caleb was still learning to play. As Devon stood by his car, Dan began circling the vehicle, his eyes scanning every inch of it like a predator stalking its prey. "Nice car you've got here, Mr. Matthews," Dan sneered. "How does someone like you afford something like this?" Devon's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. "I work hard for my money, officer. I'm on my way to an important meeting. Can you please tell me why I've been stopped?" Dan's hand hovered near his holster, his gaze sharp. "Mind if we take a look inside?" "I do mind," Devon replied, his voice firm but controlled. "I haven't done anything wrong, and I don't consent to a search." The air grew heavy with tension. Caleb's breath caught in his throat as he saw the shift in Dan's demeanor. The veteran officer's face twisted with anger. And before anyone could react, Dan yanked open the car door and began rummaging through the vehicle. Devon stepped forward, his frustration finally breaking through his calm exterior. "What are you doing? You can't just search my car without." "Stay back," Caleb blurted out, stepping between Devon and Dan, his voice trembling slightly. He didn't know what else to do, but he knew that if Devon got too close, things could get even worse. Dan, seemingly unfazed by the commotion, continued his invasive search. Caleb felt a sinking feeling in his stomach as he saw Dan discreetly pull something from his pocket. A small bag of white powder. It was so quick, so subtle, that if Caleb hadn't been watching, he might have missed it. But he saw it. He saw everything. And then it hit him. This wasn't just a case of racial profiling. This was a setup. "Got something here," Dan announced triumphantly, holding up the bag as if he'd just struck gold. "What do we have here, Mr. Matthews? Care to explain this?" Devon's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's not mine. You just planted that in my car." His calm demeanor had evaporated, replaced by a look of shock and anger. Dan smirked, snapping a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Looks like we've got ourselves a drug dealer. You're under arrest." Devon's voice rose in desperation as Dan moved to cuff him. "This is absurd. I haven't done anything wrong." Caleb stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what was happening was wrong, an undeniable abuse of power. But what could he do? If he spoke out, it would be his word against Dan's, and rookies didn't survive long if they went against veterans. As Dan locked the handcuffs around Devon's wrists, the man's pleading eyes met Caleb's. "You saw what happened," Devon said, his voice quieter now, more desperate. "You saw him plant that. You know this isn't right." Dan whipped around, glaring at Caleb. "Don't listen to him, rookie. This is how we clean up the streets." The weight of the moment crashed down on Caleb, crushing him under its force. He was torn between his duty to his partner and his moral obligation to the truth. The conflict raged inside him, threatening to tear him apart. And in that moment, Caleb knew that this wasn't just about a traffic stop. It was about something much bigger, something that would change all of their lives forever. Crossroads of conscience. The drive back to the station was tense, filled with the heavy weight of unspoken words. Devon Matthews sat in the back seat of the patrol car, his wrists tightly bound in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief. Despite his composed demeanor, his eyes betrayed the storm of emotions raging inside him. Officer Dan Walker, on the other hand, looked entirely unbothered, a satisfied grin creeping across his face as he occasionally glanced at Devon in the rearview mirror. Caleb could barely breathe. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he drove, knuckles white with tension. He'd seen everything. The planted drugs, the lie unfolding before his eyes, and the blatant abuse of power. But most of all, he saw the desperation in Devon's eyes, a look that asked for help, for justice, for someone to do the right thing. And Caleb had done nothing. "How long you been dealing, Matthews?" Dan's voice cut through the silence like a blade. His tone was mocking, dripping with condescension. "Bet you thought you could just roll through here in your fancy car, and no one would notice. Thought we'd let you off easy, huh?" Devon remained silent, staring straight ahead, his lips pressed tightly together. He had already protested his innocence enough times. He knew that speaking would get him nowhere. The trap had been set, and he was caught in it. Talking wouldn't free him. The truth wouldn't free him. Dan continued his barrage, taking Caleb's silence as consent. "You know what I can't stand? These big shot types, thinking they're above the law. Doesn't matter how much money they make or how fancy their suits are. Once a criminal, always a criminal. It's in their blood." Caleb's stomach turned, the bile rising in his throat. He couldn't take much more of this. Every word out of Dan's mouth felt like a punch to the gut. How could someone who was supposed to protect and serve all people be so consumed by hatred? "Sir," Caleb said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "maybe we should just take him to the station. Let the detectives handle it from here." Dan laughed, the sound harsh and cruel. "Still too soft, kid. You'll learn. The streets don't care about playing nice. It's a jungle out here. You either control it, or it controls you. Matthews here, he's just another predator, dressed up in a suit, hiding behind that respectability. But we see through it, don't we?" Caleb bit his lip, his mind racing. He felt like he was standing at a crossroads. His partner, the man who was supposed to show him the ropes, guide him through the challenges of being a cop, was dragging him down a path that felt wrong at every turn. And yet Caleb felt paralyzed, unsure of how to speak up, how to stand up for what he knew was right. As they approached the station, Caleb's eyes caught sight of something in the rearview mirror. Devon was staring at him. Not at Dan, not out the window, but directly at him. The look was piercing, as if Devon could see the war going on inside Caleb's head. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Caleb felt as though Devon could sense his guilt, his shame. The station loomed ahead, its gray exterior cold and foreboding. Caleb pulled the car into the lot, parked, and shut off the engine. Dan hopped out immediately, dragging Devon out of the back seat with practiced ease. As they walked inside, Caleb trailed behind, his mind still spinning with the events of the past hour. Inside, the familiar hum of the station greeted them. Detectives shuffled papers, phones rang, and officers exchanged casual conversation. But as soon as Dan strode in with Devon in tow, all eyes turned toward them. Caleb could feel the shift in the room, the quiet, scrutinizing glances, the unspoken judgments that came with every new arrest. But this one felt different. There was a weight in the air, a palpable tension that Caleb couldn't ignore. "Got ourselves a big one here," Dan announced loudly, shoving Devon toward the desk sergeant. "Caught him driving around with a nice little stash of cocaine in his car. You know how these types are." The desk sergeant, a grizzled man in his late 50s, looked at Dan with a raised eyebrow. "You planted it?" he asked in a low voice, his tone casual, as though he were asking about the weather. Dan's smirk deepened. "Had to make sure we got something on him. These guys are slippery, always got some lawyer ready to pounce." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It wasn't just that Dan had done something wrong. It was that everyone seemed to know, and no one cared. This was the culture, the unspoken code that allowed officers like Dan to operate with impunity. Devon stood silently by the desk, his face impassive. But when Caleb glanced at him, he saw a flicker of something in Devon's eyes. Not just anger, but a quiet determination, as if he had made some internal decision. Caleb wondered what that could be. Devon hadn't fought, hadn't screamed, hadn't even raised his voice in the patrol car. He had simply accepted his fate, But now, in the bright fluorescent light of the station, there was something different about him. Something almost dangerous. "Put him in holding," the desk sergeant said with a wave of his hand, returning to his paperwork as if this were just another routine booking. Dan nodded, gripping Devon's arm and leading him toward the cells. Caleb followed behind, his steps heavy with indecision. The walk through the station felt like a slow march towards some inevitable disaster. With every step, Caleb's guilt and fear grew stronger, gnawing at him from the inside. Once they reached the holding area, Dan unlocked the cell and shoved Devon inside. The clang of the metal bars echoed through the room, a sound that felt final, like the closing of a chapter. Devon turned to face Dan and Caleb, his face calm but his eyes burning with intensity. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice steady. "You think you can do this to me and just walk away? You've made a mistake, Officer Walker." Dan laughed again, but this time there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Yeah, and what are you gonna do about it? You're just another punk who got caught. No one's gonna listen to you." Devon didn't respond. He simply turned and sat down on the bench inside the cell, his posture relaxed, as if he knew something they didn't. Caleb felt the air shift again, a cold chill running down his spine. Something was wrong. Something bigger than this moment, bigger than the lie Dan had constructed. He could feel it coming, like a storm brewing on the horizon. As they left the holding area, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were on borrowed time. His mind raced with possibilities, his conscience screaming at him to do something. Anything. To stop this before it spiraled further out of control. But fear held him back. Fear of retaliation. Fear of losing his job. Fear of standing up against the system he had just entered. Back at his desk, Caleb sat down heavily, the weight of the evening pressing down on him. Dan leaned back in his chair, satisfied with how the night had gone, his feet propped up on the desk as he scrolled through his phone. "See, kid," Dan said with a smirk, "this is how you survive out there. You don't let them get one over on you. You control the situation, no matter what." But Caleb wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the events in his head over and over again. The look in Devon's eyes, the planted drugs, the casual acceptance of wrongdoing, the trap that had been set. And now, there was no turning back. The weight of silence. Caleb sat in the dimly lit break room, nursing a cup of cold coffee that he hadn't touched in over an hour. His hands were clenched around the paper cup, his eyes staring into the dark liquid as though it held the answers to all his questions. The buzz of the station outside seemed distant, like background noise in a world he no longer felt a part of. The events of the night replayed in his mind on a relentless loop. The planted drugs, the sickening ease with which Dan had set up Devon Matthews, and Caleb's own inability to do anything about it. His stomach churned, and a part of him wanted to stand up, march into the captain's office, and tell the truth. But the fear held him in place. What would happen if he spoke up? Dan had been on the force for over 20 years. He was well-liked by many, feared by some, and respected by most. He had friends in high places, and rookies like Caleb. They were expendable. "You did what you had to do," Caleb muttered to himself, trying to convince his own conscience. You didn't have a choice. But he knew that was a lie. He did have a choice. He could have stepped in. He could have stopped Dan from planting the drugs, from arresting an innocent man. But in that critical moment, he had frozen, paralyzed by his fear of Dan, his fear of the system, and most of all, his fear of losing his job. Caleb had seen what happened to officers who didn't fall in line. They were ostracized, pushed out of the department, or worse. As he sat there, his thoughts spiraling, the door to the break room creaked open. Caleb looked up to see Officer Lisa Collins step inside, a concerned expression on her face. Lisa had been with the department for nearly a decade, and while she didn't hold the same level of influence as Dan, she had built a reputation for being fair and tough. She wasn't one to tolerate nonsense, and Caleb often looked to her for guidance when things got tough. "Caleb," she said softly, her eyes scanning his face. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Caleb forced a weak smile. Yeah, I'm fine. Just rough night. Lisa sat down across from him, her own cup of coffee in hand. She didn't speak right away, instead giving Caleb the space to continue if he wanted. But when he didn't, she leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. Look, I've been on the force long enough to know when something's eating at someone. You don't have to tell me everything, but if something happened out there, you can talk to me. I'm not here to judge. Caleb hesitated. The words sat on the tip of his tongue, waiting to spill out, but fear clamped his jaw shut. If he said anything to Lisa, it could get back to Dan, and if it did, he could kiss his career goodbye. But then he thought of Devin, sitting in that holding cell, waiting for his life to be turned upside down by charges that weren't even real. The memory of the planted drugs flashed in Caleb's mind, and a wave of guilt washed over him. Lisa noticed the conflict in Caleb's eyes, and she leaned back, giving him space. I get it, she said quietly. This job isn't easy. Sometimes you see things that don't sit right with you, and sometimes it's hard to know what the right thing to do is. She paused for a moment, her eyes searching his face. But you need to ask yourself if you're doing this job for the right reasons. Because once you start compromising, once you start letting things slide, it gets easier and easier to look the other way. Her words struck Caleb like a hammer to his chest. That's exactly what he had done, look the other way. He had watched Dan plant the drugs and arrest Devin without saying a word. He had let his fear of the consequences dictate his actions. And now, the weight of that silence was crushing him. Lisa must have sensed the turmoil inside him because she reached across the table and placed a hand on his arm. You don't have to do this alone, she said softly. If something happened out there and you don't feel right about it, there are ways to handle it. You don't have to keep it bottled up. Caleb's throat tightened, and for a moment, he thought he might break down right there in front of her. But instead, he nodded, muttering, Thanks, Lisa. I'll be okay. She gave him a long, searching look before standing up and heading toward the door. My door's always open, Caleb. Remember that. As she left the room, Caleb felt a surge of frustration and guilt welling up inside him. He had a chance to say something, to do the right thing, but he hadn't. He had let the opportunity slip through his fingers. And now Devin was sitting in a cell, facing charges that could ruin his life. The sound of footsteps snapped Caleb out of his thoughts. Dan was back, swaggering into the break room with a smug grin plastered across his face. Kid, you wouldn't believe the look on that guy's face when I tossed him in the cell. Dan chuckled, grabbing a soda from the fridge. That's the thing with these types. They think they're invincible, but one little mistake, and they're right back where they belong. Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't make a mistake, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Dan paused mid-sip, raising an eyebrow. What's that, rookie? Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He wanted to scream, to shout that everything about the arrest was wrong, that Devin was innocent, and that Dan was corrupt. But instead, the words that came out were barely above a whisper. Nothing, Caleb muttered, looking away. I just mean, it felt wrong. Dan's smirk returned as he popped the tab on his soda. Wrong. There's nothing wrong about keeping the streets safe, kid. You'll learn that soon enough. Trust me, this is how you survive in this job. The sooner you get on board, the easier it'll be for you. Caleb clenched his fists under the table, his frustration mounting. But planting drugs, that's not right, Dan. For a moment, Dan's expression faltered, his eyes narrowing slightly. But then he laughed, the sound hollow and cold. Planting. Who said anything about planting? I found those drugs fair and square. And unless you want to say something different, that's the story we're sticking with. The threat hung in the air between them like a guillotine. Caleb understood the implications. If he spoke up, If he tried to challenge Dan's version of events, his career would be over before it even began, and Dan would make sure of it. "Listen," Dan continued, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone. "You're new. I get it. You haven't seen how bad it can get out there. But trust me, you have to make tough calls sometimes. You have to bend the rules if you want to keep order. Matthews, he's no saint. Guys like him think they can get away with anything because they've got money and influence. But we're the ones keeping this city clean. We're the ones who get to decide what's right." Caleb's stomach churned. He wanted to argue, to push back against Dan's twisted logic, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stared at the table, his mind racing. He could feel himself being pulled deeper into the abyss, further away from the ideals that had brought him to the police force in the first place. Dan slapped him on the back, his mood lighter now. "Chin up, rookie. You'll see. You'll thank me one day for showing you how it's really done." With that, Dan strolled out of the room, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts once again. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on him like a lead blanket. Caleb sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the coffee cup in his hands. His mind kept going back to Lisa's words. "You need to ask yourself if you're doing this job for the right reasons." Was this why he had become a cop? To watch innocent people get railroaded by corrupt officers? To keep silent while injustice played out right in front of him? The thoughts wouldn't leave him alone. Every time he tried to justify his inaction, he thought of Devin, sitting in that cell, his life hanging in the balance. He had to do something. But what? If he reported Dan, would anyone believe him? Or would they side with the veteran officer and dismiss Caleb as just another disgruntled rookie? Caleb's hands trembled as he set down the cup. He couldn't keep living like this, trapped in the weight of his silence. He had to make a choice, to either stand up and do the right thing, or become just another part of the system he had once wanted to change. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at the screen. A message from Lisa. "If you need to talk, I'm here. Don't carry this alone." Caleb stared at the message for a long time. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. Maybe there was a way to fix this without destroying his life in the process. But that would mean stepping out of the shadows and into the light. And once he did that, there would be no turning back. The decision loomed before him, as heavy as the silence that surrounded him. And Caleb knew he had to make it soon, breaking the silence. The next morning, Caleb awoke to the sound of his phone vibrating on the nightstand beside his bed. The harsh, early sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of his small apartment, casting long shadows across the room. He groggily reached for his phone, squinting at the screen. A text message from Dan. "Meeting at the station. 9 a.m. sharp. Bring your A game, rookie." Caleb's heart sank. His body felt heavy, as if the weight of the previous night's events had seeped into his bones, turning every movement into a laborious task. He had barely slept, his mind racing all night, replaying the arrest of Devin Matthews and the guilt that had wrapped itself around him like a vice. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Devin's face, calm, composed, yet pleading silently for help. The fear of what was to come gnawed at Caleb's insides. The station would be buzzing with talk about the arrest, and Dan would be at the center of it, relishing the attention. Caleb could already hear the chatter, the praise Dan would receive for making another big bust. And what would he do? Stand by in silence? He couldn't do it anymore. Something had to change. He dragged himself out of bed, his body aching with exhaustion and stress. As he stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, his face looked pale and drawn, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He barely recognized himself. What had happened to the eager young cop who had joined the force to make a difference, to protect and serve with honor? The man staring back at him looked broken, hollowed out by the weight of a system that seemed determined to swallow him whole. After a quick shower, Caleb dressed and left his apartment, heading toward the station. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if he were walking toward some inevitable doom. The streets were quiet, the early morning rush yet to begin, but Caleb barely noticed. His mind was consumed with thoughts of what he was about to face. He knew he couldn't keep silent any longer. But the question was, how? As he approached the station, Caleb's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Lisa. "Still thinking about what we talked about. Let me know if you want to grab coffee after shift." He stared at the message, feeling a strange mix of relief and fear. Lisa was the only person he could talk to, the only one who seemed to sense that something was wrong. But even she didn't know the full extent of what had happened. And if Caleb confided in her, he would be dragging her into the storm that was coming. The thought of Lisa's calm, steady presence was a small comfort, though. He typed back a quick reply. "Yeah, maybe later. Thanks." He didn't know if he'd have the courage to tell her everything. But for now, knowing she was there helped. When Caleb walked into the station, the buzz of activity hit him immediately. Detectives and officers moved through the halls, filing paperwork, answering phones, and preparing for the day's shift. Caleb's stomach twisted as he spotted Dan near the front desk, talking animatedly with a group of officers. His deep voice boomed through the room, accompanied by the sound of laughter. "And I said to him, 'You're gonna regret messing with me, pal,' right before I slapped those cuffs on him." "He didn't see it coming," Dan said, grinning from ear to ear. The other officers chuckled, nodding in approval. Caleb could barely suppress the wave of nausea that washed over him. The casual arrogance, the way Dan twisted the events to paint himself as the hero, it was sickening. Caleb wondered if any of them suspected the truth, or if they simply accepted Dan's version of the story without question. As Caleb approached the group, Dan caught sight of him and raised his voice even louder, clearly putting on a show for his rookie partner. "There he is, the man of the hour," Dan bellowed, clapping Caleb on the back with far too much enthusiasm. "Caleb here was right by my side when we took down that piece of work, Matthews, last night. Hell of a bust, wasn't it, rookie?" Caleb forced a smile, but it felt more like a grimace. His heart pounded in his chest. The words he wanted to say stuck in his throat. He felt like he was drowning in the lies, suffocated by the facade he was being forced to uphold. "Yeah," Caleb mumbled. "Hell of a bust." Dan grinned, clearly pleased with himself. "You see, this is what it's all about. Cleaning up the streets, putting the scum where they belong. We made a real difference last night, kid. Don't forget that." Caleb bit his tongue, trying to keep the anger from spilling out. He didn't trust himself to speak. If he opened his mouth, he was afraid of what might come out. As Dan continued to boast about the arrest, Caleb's mind drifted. He couldn't keep going like this. He needed to make a decision. The words Lisa had said to him the night before echoed in his mind. "You don't have to do this alone." But what could he do? Who would believe him if he spoke up? He was a rookie, barely a few months into the job, while Dan was a veteran with connections all over the department. If Caleb accused him of planting evidence, it would be his word against Dan's, and everyone knew how that would turn out. Still, the thought of staying silent made him feel sick. Before he could spiral further into his thoughts, the sound of a door opening caught his attention. Captain Marcus Williams stepped into the room, his commanding presence immediately drawing the attention of everyone around him. Caleb had never spoken to Captain Williams directly, but he had heard plenty about him. The man was known for his integrity, his ability to lead without compromising his principles. He was the reason many officers, especially the newer recruits, believed that there was still hope for the department. But as soon as Captain Williams entered the room, the energy shifted. The laughter died down, and an uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Dan, who had been so loud and confident just moments ago, seemed to shrink ever so slightly, his cocky grin fading. Captain Williams approached the desk, his sharp eyes surveying the room. When his gaze landed on Caleb, he paused for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Dan. "Officer Walker, Captain Williams said, his voice steady but firm. "I need a word with you in my office. Now." Dan's smile faltered for the briefest of moments, but he quickly recovered, nodding. "Sure thing, Cap. Just telling the boys about last night's bust." "I'm aware," Captain Williams replied, his tone clipped. "My office." "Now." Dan shot a quick glance at Caleb, as if trying to gauge his reaction, before following the captain toward the office. Caleb watched them go, his heart pounding. Something was happening. He didn't know what, but the look on Captain Williams's face told him that this wasn't just a routine meeting. As the door to Captain Williams's office closed behind them, Caleb stood frozen in place, a mix of dread and hope swirling inside him. Maybe the captain knew something. Maybe Devon had already made a call, or maybe someone else had seen what had happened. But whatever it wasn't over. Caleb could feel the storm brewing, and he was standing right in the middle of it. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. The hum of the station buzzed around Caleb, but he barely heard any of it. His eyes remained locked on the door to Captain Williams's office, his mind racing with possibilities. What was Dan saying in there? Was he spinning more lies, covering his tracks? Or was the captain already onto him? Before Caleb could torture himself with more questions, the door opened and Dan stepped out, his face pale, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at Caleb or anyone else as he walked past the desk and out of the room. There was something in the way he moved, a stiffness, a tension that hadn't been there before. Then, Captain Williams emerged from the office, his eyes scanning the room once more. He didn't say a word as he approached Caleb, but when he reached him, he stopped, his gaze locking onto Caleb's. "Officer Stone," the captain said quietly, his voice low enough that only Caleb could hear. "Come with me. We need to talk." Caleb's heart raced as he followed Captain Williams into the office. This was it, the moment he had been dreading, and yet the moment he had been waiting for. The door closed behind them, and the captain motioned for Caleb to sit. The room was silent for a long moment as Captain Williams sat down across from Caleb, his sharp eyes studying him. Caleb felt like he was being scrutinized, like every thought, every fear, every secret he was carrying was laid bare before the captain. "I'm going to ask you a question," Captain Williams said, his voice calm but serious. "And I want you to answer me truthfully. Whatever you say stays in this room. Understood?" Caleb nodded, his throat dry. The captain leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Caleb's. "What happened last night during that arrest?" Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. He could either continue to protect Dan, continue to live with the guilt and the lies, or he could tell the truth, no matter the consequences. His mind raced, but in the end, it wasn't fear that guided his decision. It was the memory of Devon's eyes, pleading for justice. Taking a deep breath, Caleb opened his mouth to speak, and for the first time since the arrest, the silence began to break. "I need to tell you everything, sir," Caleb said, his voice trembling but resolute. "Something happened out there, and it wasn't right." A line in the sand. Caleb had never felt more vulnerable than he did in Captain Marcus Williams's office. The room was small, the blinds drawn tightly to block out the bright mid-morning sun. A single file cabinet stood in the corner, and the captain's desk was neat and meticulously organized, reflecting the man who now sat across from him. Captain Williams, composed and silent, studied Caleb with an intensity that made him feel exposed, like every secret he'd been carrying was laid out in front of them both. The air was thick with anticipation, and Caleb could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him like 1,000 pounds. This was it, the crossroads he had feared and avoided. The line between who he had been as a rookie cop, too afraid to stand up to the corruption he had witnessed, and the person he needed to become. The words caught in his throat, heavy with consequence. His career, his future, everything hung in the balance of what he said next. Captain Williams leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Caleb's. "I know this isn't easy, Officer Stone," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But the truth never is. Whatever you tell me stays between us for now. But I need you to be honest. If something happened last night that you know wasn't right, now's the time to speak up." Caleb swallowed hard, his mouth dry. His mind was racing, every possible outcome flashing before him like lightning in a storm. If he told the truth, Dan would come after him. Maybe not physically, but he'd find a way to destroy Caleb's career, to ruin his name in the department. Caleb had seen it happen before. Rookies who didn't fall in line, who refused to play the game, were blackballed, ostracized, and eventually forced out. But the other option, staying silent, felt even worse. He couldn't live with the guilt anymore. He couldn't be the kind of cop who let an innocent man like Devin Matthews take the fall for something he didn't do. The thought of Devin sitting in that holding cell, his life on the verge of being destroyed, made Caleb's stomach churn with shame. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Caleb spoke. "Sir," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "something happened last night. Something wrong." Captain Williams didn't react immediately. He just nodded slightly, giving Caleb the space to continue. Caleb took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "When we pulled over Devin Matthews, there was nothing suspicious. He wasn't speeding, he wasn't swerving, he wasn't doing anything wrong. But Officer Walker, Dan, he insisted that we stop him anyway. He was convinced that Matthews was up to something just because of the way he looked. It didn't feel right from the start." Caleb paused, glancing up at Captain Williams. The captain's expression remained neutral, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that told Caleb he was listening closely. And then, when Dan searched the car, Caleb's throat tightened, and he had to force the words out. He planted drugs under the driver's seat. I saw him do it. He pulled a small bag of cocaine from his own pocket and slipped it under the seat when Matthews wasn't looking. The silence that followed Caleb's confession was suffocating. Captain Williams sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he absorbed what Caleb had just said. Caleb could feel his heart pounding in his chest, every beat echoing in his ears. He had done it. He had crossed the line, and there was no going back now. Captain Williams's gaze didn't waver as he finally spoke. "You're saying that Officer Walker planted evidence during the arrest?" Caleb nodded slowly, his stomach in knots. "Yes, sir. He planted it, and then he arrested Matthews on drug possession charges. But Matthews, he's innocent. He didn't have any drugs in the car. It was all a setup." For a moment, Captain Williams didn't say anything. His face was unreadable, his eyes locked on Caleb's as if trying to assess the truth of what he was hearing. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the captain stood up and walked to the window, parting the blinds slightly to let in a sliver of light. "When I took this job," Williams said quietly, his back to Caleb, "I knew it wasn't going to be easy. The department has problems, big ones, but I also knew that change wouldn't come if good officers like you, didn't stand up and speak out when they saw something wrong." He turned to face Caleb, his expression now stern. "But you understand the gravity of what you're telling me, don't you?" Caleb nodded again, his throat dry. "Yes, sir, I do." Captain Williams crossed his arms, pacing slowly across the room. "If what you're saying is true, and I believe it is, this is going to blow the lid off this department. Walker has been here for a long time. He's well connected, and a lot of officers look up to him. But if he's been planting evidence, framing innocent people, we're talking about corruption that goes far deeper than just one bad cop." Caleb felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. He had known this would be big, but hearing Captain Williams lay it out so bluntly made the reality of the situation hit even harder. This wasn't just about Dan Walker. It was about a culture of corruption that had been allowed to fester in the department for years, maybe even decades. "What happens now?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling slightly. Captain Williams stopped pacing and looked directly at Caleb. Now, we do this the right way. I'm going to need a formal statement from you, in detail, about everything that happened last night. We'll also need to secure the evidence, the drugs, the arrest report, anything that can be used to prove your account. But you need to understand something, Officer Stone. Once we move forward with this, there's no turning back. Walker will be suspended, but his allies in the department will come after you. They'll try to discredit you, to make you look like the bad guy. Are you prepared for that? Caleb's chest tightened with fear, but he nodded. I don't have a choice, sir. I can't live with this hanging over me. Devin Matthews is sitting in a cell for something he didn't do. I can't just let that happen. Captain Williams's expression softened for a moment, and he nodded in approval. That's the right answer, Stone. This job isn't about loyalty to individuals. It's about loyalty to the truth, to justice, and sometimes that means standing alone. He walked back to his desk and sat down, motioning for Caleb to do the same. I'll take care of the formalities. Your job now is to stay focused. This is going to get ugly before it gets better. But if we do this right, we can clean house. And I'll have your back, Stone. That's a promise. Caleb felt a flicker of hope in the captain's words. For the first time since the arrest, he didn't feel so alone. But the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. He knew what was coming. Dan wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and Caleb had seen firsthand how the old boys club protected their own. He would be branded a snitch, a traitor. The whispers would start, the rumors would spread, and soon enough, he would find himself isolated in the very department he had once dreamed of serving with honor. But he couldn't let that stop him. Not anymore. Captain Williams picked up the phone on his desk and dialed a number. I need internal affairs in my office right away, he said, his voice firm. He hung up and turned back to Caleb. This is going to move quickly. Be ready. Caleb nodded, trying to steady his nerves. He knew that once internal affairs was involved, the investigation would take on a life of its own. And while Captain Williams had promised to have his back, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a battle he wasn't fully prepared for. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and two men from Internal Affairs entered the room. They looked serious, their faces set in hard lines. One of them, a tall, thin man with sharp features, stepped forward. Captain Williams, the man said, nodding in acknowledgement. You called. The captain motioned toward Caleb. This is Officer Caleb Stone. He has information about an incident that took place during an arrest last night involving Officer Dan Walker. I need you to take his statement and start a formal investigation. The man from Internal Affairs nodded and pulled out a notepad. Let's get started, he said, turning to Caleb. Officer Stone, I'm going to need you to walk us through everything that happened, from the moment you pulled over the suspect to the moment the arrest was made. Caleb took a deep breath. This was it, the moment of truth. He began to speak, his voice steady but low, recounting every detail of the arrest, every lie, every action that had led to Devin Matthews being falsely accused. As the words spilled out, Caleb felt a strange sense of relief, as if the weight of his silence was finally being lifted from his shoulders. When he finished, the man from Internal Affairs looked up from his notes, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Officer Stone, he said. We'll begin the investigation immediately, but I want you to understand, this is going to be a difficult process. There will be pushback. I understand, Caleb said quietly, but I can't stay silent anymore. As the officers from Internal Affairs left the room, Captain Williams gave Caleb a long, appraising look. You did the right thing, he said, but this is just the beginning. Be prepared for what's coming. Caleb nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and resolve settle deep in his chest. He had made his choice. There was no turning back now. As he walked out of the office, the station buzzed around him as if nothing had changed. But for Caleb, everything had. The firestorm. The station was eerily quiet as Caleb stepped out of Captain Williams's office, For a moment, he stood still, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of what he had just done settling deep into his bones. The bustling energy of the department seemed distant now, as if Caleb had crossed an invisible threshold, stepping into a new reality where nothing would ever be the same. The door to the office behind him clicked shut with a finality that echoed through the hallway, and Caleb knew the storm was about to break. He could already feel the eyes of his fellow officers on him as he made his way back to his desk. Some glanced quickly away when he looked in their direction. Others continued to stare, their expressions unreadable. The whispers had already begun, a low murmur of curiosity and suspicion rippling through the room. He could almost hear the questions forming in their minds. What did Caleb say to the captain? Why was internal affairs involved? What was going on? Caleb sat down at his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to focus on the paperwork in front of him. But it was no use. His mind was spinning, replaying the conversation with Captain Williams and the officers from Internal Affairs. He had done the right thing. He knew that. But the fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. How would Dan react when he found out? And more importantly, how would the rest of the department respond when they learned that Caleb had broken the code of silence? He didn't have to wait long to find out. Less than an hour later, Dan Walker stormed into the station, his face twisted in rage. The moment he entered, the atmosphere shifted, tension crackling in the air like static electricity. Officers glanced at each other nervously, sensing that something was about to happen. Dan's eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on Caleb, his expression darkened into something almost feral. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He had known this confrontation was coming, but he wasn't prepared for how visceral it would feel. "Stone," Dan barked, his voice booming through the station. "You and me. Outside." Now, the room fell into a stunned silence. Every eye was on Caleb now, waiting to see how he would respond. Caleb swallowed hard, his mouth dry, but he knew he couldn't back down. Not now. He pushed himself up from his desk, his legs feeling like lead, and followed Dan out the door, into the cold autumn air. The moment they were outside, Dan rounded on him, his fists clenched at his sides. His face was red with anger, and his eyes burned with fury. "What the hell did you say to the captain?" Dan demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "I know you were in there, talking to him and Internal Affairs. What did you tell them?" Caleb stood his ground, though his heart was racing. "I told them the truth, Dan. About what you did. About the drugs you planted in Devin Matthews' car." Dan's face twisted with disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend what he was hearing. Then his expression hardened into something darker, more menacing. He took a step closer to Caleb, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You've got no idea what you've done, rookie. You think you can just walk into my world and turn everything upside down. You're nothing. You've been here, what, a few months. You don't know how things work around here. You don't know what it takes to keep this city safe." Caleb felt the fear gnawing at his insides, but he refused to back down. "What you did wasn't about keeping the city safe. It was about your ego, about proving a point. You framed an innocent man because you didn't like the way he looked. That's not justice, Dan. That's corruption." Dan's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, Caleb thought he might take a swing at him. But instead, Dan's voice became dangerously calm, a tone that chilled Caleb to the core. "You think you're better than me. You think you're some kind of hero, because you ran to Captain Williams like a scared little kid. This department is built on loyalty. Stone, you don't turn on your own. You don't turn on your brothers. What do you think is going to happen now? You think Williams is going to save you. You think Internal Affairs is going to clean this place up. You're a fool if you believe that." Caleb's stomach churned, but he held his ground. "I don't care what happens to me, Dan. I couldn't stay silent anymore. What you did was wrong, and you're going to have to answer for it." Dan's laugh was cold and humorless. "Oh, you're going to care, rookie, Because when this is all over, you'll be lucky if you can find a job as a security guard at a strip mall. You're done here. You're done in this town." With that, Dan turned and stalked back into the station, leaving Caleb standing alone in the parking lot. The cold wind whipped around him, stinging his face, but it was nothing compared to the icy dread that settled in his chest. Dan's threat hung in the air, heavy and real. Caleb knew he wasn't exaggerating. Dan had the connections, the influence, and the experience to make good on his promise. Caleb's career might well be over before it had even begun. But as he stood there, breathing in the crisp autumn air, Caleb realized something. He wasn't afraid anymore, not of Dan, not of the consequences. The fear had been replaced by something else, something stronger: resolve. He had done the right thing. And no matter what happened next, he could live with himself knowing that he had stood up for what was right. When Caleb finally re-entered the station, the atmosphere was charged. It was clear that word had spread quickly. Officers who had once greeted him with friendly nods now avoided his gaze, some openly glaring at him as he passed. The whispers followed him down the hallway, low murmurs of betrayal and suspicion. Caleb could feel the shift, the isolation creeping in around him like a tightening noose. He was no longer one of them. He was an outsider now, a pariah in his own department. The day dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Caleb kept his head down, focusing on his work, trying to drown out the noise around him. But it was impossible to ignore the growing sense of unease. He could feel the tension building, like the air before a storm. And when the end of his shift finally came, Caleb gathered his things quickly, eager to get out of the station and away from the oppressive atmosphere. As he stepped out into the parking lot, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Lisa. "Coffee. Now. Meet me at Rosie's Cafe." Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He needed to talk to someone, and Lisa was the only person he trusted right now. He texted her back quickly and headed toward the cafe, his thoughts still swirling. Rosie's Cafe was a small, cozy spot just a few blocks from the station, frequented by cops and locals alike. When Caleb walked in, the familiar smell of coffee and baked goods greeted him, offering a brief moment of comfort. Lisa was already seated at a table near the back, her face serious as she watched him approach. "Sit," she said, motioning to the chair across from her. Caleb sat down, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on him. Lisa didn't waste any time. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice low but direct, words spreading fast. "You talked to Captain Williams. You told him everything, didn't you?" Caleb nodded, exhaustion lining his features. "Yeah, I couldn't stay quiet anymore, Lisa. Dan planted those drugs. I saw him do it. I couldn't let him get away with it." Lisa leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "That took guts, but you need to understand something, Caleb. This isn't over. Dan's got a lot of friends in the department, people who will protect him no matter what. And now that you've spoken up, they're going to come after you. You're in the crosshairs now." Caleb sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know. Dan already threatened me. Said I'm done here, that my career's over." Lisa leaned forward, her expression serious. "He's not wrong, Caleb. This is going to get ugly, but you did the right thing. And you're not alone in this. There are good people in the department, people who want to see it cleaned up. Captain Williams is one of them. And so am I." Her words were a balm to Caleb's frayed nerves. He had been feeling so alone, so isolated since he had made the decision to speak up, but hearing Lisa say that she was with him gave him a sense of hope he hadn't felt in days. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know if I could do this by myself." "You're not by yourself," Lisa said firmly. "And don't let them make you feel like you are. We've been needing someone to shake things up for a long time. You just lit the match. Now we've got to keep the fire burning." Caleb nodded, feeling a surge of determination. The fear wasn't gone. He knew there were hard days ahead, days where he would be tested and pushed to his limits. But now he knew he wasn't alone in this fight. As they sat in the quiet cafe, the weight of the day seemed to lift, if only for a moment. Caleb looked around at the familiar faces, the ordinary people going about their lives, and he realized something important. This wasn't just about him or Dan or even the department. This was about justice, about standing up for what was right, even when it was hard, even when it came at a cost. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Caleb felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The storm was far from over, but Caleb was ready to face it head on. And he wasn't afraid anymore.